here in death, my horrors continue.
On May 15th, 2022, 69-year-old John McCary of Long Beach, California, sent a text message to a member of his family. He told them that he was headed out on a few errands and would call once he returned. John was never heard from again. 3 weeks later, his car was found abandoned on Lake Hill Road near Panamint Springs, and just a quarter mile away lay John's severely dehydrated corpse. It's not clear why he stopped his car that day, but he did so in a place known all over the world as Death Valley. Carving through the deserts of eastern California, Death Valley is widely believed to be one of the hottest places on Earth. Having originally been home to the Timbisha tribe, the valley received its English name during the Great California Gold Rush of 1849. Dozens of pioneer wagon trains would venture into the valley, never to return, and their fellow travelers learned quickly to either avoid it or cross it overnight. On July 10, 1913, the United States Weather Bureau recorded a high temperature of 134 degrees Fahrenheit, 56.7 degrees Celsius at the valley's Furnace Creek, which stands as the highest ambient air temperature ever recorded on the surface of the Earth. The accuracy of these readings has since been disputed by modern experts, but it's safe to say that Death Valley has more than earned the name. Less than a month after the discovery of John McCary's corpse, the body of 67-year-old Marine veteran David Keller was found halfway between Zabriskie Point and Furnace Creek. He'd been reported missing just days earlier, during a heat wave in which temperatures had reached a sweltering 123 degrees Fahrenheit. When his car was found, search and rescue teams observed a handwritten note displayed on the dash. "Out of gas," it said. His body was found 2.5 miles from his car, but only 30 feet from California Highway 190, which was obscured by a gentle slope and a few mesquite trees. If David had managed to just go a few more feet, his life might have been saved. Just days later, the National Park Service announced that it was looking for a third man, Peter Haratunian, whose vehicle was found abandoned by park rangers on May 23rd. They also encouraged those visiting or simply driving through Death Valley to do so only during the cooler parts of the day and to keep plenty of water at hand. To date, Peter Haratunian has yet to be found, but sadly, this summer has yet claimed another unfortunate victim. As recently as July 3rd, 2023, a 65-year-old San Diego man was found dead from heat stroke after a drive through Death Valley ended with 2 flat tires. The air conditioning of the driver's vehicle had malfunctioned either before or during the drive, meaning he had no way to keep himself cool after pulling over. The vehicle did not crash but had 2 flat tires when stopped, the Park Service shared in a press release. And the initial investigation suggests that heat-related illness may have caused the driver to run off the road. Prior to the man's death, temperatures had reached 126 degrees Fahrenheit, while the overnight low temperature remained a jaw-dropping 98 degrees. Extreme heat deaths are the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, with an annual average of 702 heat-related fatalities. There are 2 kinds of heat stroke: classic and exertional. Classic heat stroke typically strikes infants, the elderly, and the obese, as well as those suffering from chronic medical conditions such as diabetes or heart disease. Exertional heat stroke, on the other hand, can affect perfectly healthy individuals. Following a period of intense overexertion, distance runners, cyclists, and other endurance athletes sometimes experience what's referred to as exercise-induced hyperthermia. That's hyperthermia, as in overheating, not hypothermia, which would refer to cold conditions, and generally speaking, there's no lasting damage to be suffered from a brief hypothermic reaction, but an extensive one can induce some serious physiological complications. Perhaps the most frightening thing is that it's almost like a nuclear meltdown. Once the body reaches a certain temperature, its own attempts to remedy the issue will only increase body heat, like a runaway freight train catapulting towards organ failure, brain damage, and eventually death. It seems a grim kind of mercy that those who suffer from extreme heat stroke experience confusion, semi-consciousness, or hallucination before they pass. Because the actual details of death by hypothermia are beyond horrifying, and although each heat stroke victim may exhibit varying responses to extreme internal temperatures, it generally goes a little something like this. As your core temperature reaches 105 to 106 degrees, your limbs and core become racked with painful seizures. And then, as it ticks over to 107 to 109 degrees, victims begin vomiting and soiling themselves. At 110 to 111, mass cell death commences as vital proteins begin to distort and denature. The cells in your liver begin to die, meaning the blood is no longer filtered of toxic substances, and as the tiny tubes in your kidneys are slowly cooked, the toxicity level of the blood only rises. The large but delicate Purkinje neurons in your brain begin to break down, meaning your heartbeat becomes irregular and arrhythmic. Muscle tissue begins to degenerate, while blood starts to leak from vessels all over your body. Those who survive this long will begin to see blood in their vomit, and as holes form in the upper and lower intestines, other secretions become tinged with hemorrhaging blood. In a last-ditch effort, your circulatory system responds to all the damage by clotting your blood, thinking your vessels have been severed. This triggers what physicians call a clotting cascade. As your insides liquefy and congeal, purple hemorrhagic spots appear on your skin. Those, the bloody vomit, and your convulsions are the only external hints of the total devastation suffered by your internal organs. And that's how those who die in Death Valley spend their final hours, overcome with confusion, racked with pain, cooking from the inside out. So this summer, wherever you might be, please remain as safe and hydrated as possible, because for many, an afternoon's drive through a dusty desert valley might just be their last. In mid-October of 1972, Louisiana Congressman Hale Boggs packed his bags and caught a flight up to the largest but youngest state in the Union, Alaska. He was a man on a mission and hoped to turn the tide of a very contentious general election in which fellow Democrat Nick Begich was facing an uphill battle against the more popular Republican candidate Don Young. Boggs' primary goal was to raise funds for Begich's political war chest, but the charismatic Cajun couldn't resist some good old-fashioned Southern-style glad-handling with potential voters, and often accompanied his colleague on the campaign trail. Then on October 16th of 1972, with less than a month before voting day, Boggs and Begich decided to take a flight from Anchorage, Alaska's most populated city, to the state capital of Juneau. The 90-minute flight took off after dark, with the politicians intending on a few hours' sleep in a Juneau hotel before starting bright and early on the campaign trail. But despite taking off without incident, the plane carrying Boggs and Begich never landed, and what followed was one of the largest search and rescue efforts in Alaska's history. As per Alaskan state law, the small aircraft which carried Boggs and Begich was required to carry an emergency location transmitter. When activated, this device would relay 2 locations to state aviation authorities. The first location would mark the point where an aircraft first ran into trouble, while the second would mark the site of the aircraft's crash landing. But what puzzled investigators was the fact that the Cessna hadn't sent out a single emergency transmission prior to its disappearance. To some, this suggested that the plane's pilot had neglected to bring one aboard prior to takeoff, yet multiple witnesses stated that they were quite sure that the pilot was carrying a portable emergency transponder in his flight gear that night. On November 24, 1972, 39 days after they first went missing, the search for Boggs and Begich was called off. Both were later declared missing, presumed dead. Aviation investigators concluded that there was no way the pilot had a transponder on his person, or he'd have most certainly activated it at the first sign of trouble. The only other explanation would be some kind of catastrophic mid-flight event, such as a collision with another aircraft or some kind of surface-to-air missile strike. Yet in more than 5 weeks of searching, not a single scrap of airplane debris was ever found. To some, the deaths of Congressman Boggs and Representative Begich are a tragic but isolated mystery, yet to others, it's just the tip of a deep and very terrifying iceberg known as the Black Triangle. The Black Triangle cuts through 4 of Alaska's 12 boroughs, with its corners comprising large swaths of land from Juneau and Yakutat in the southeast, all the way to the Barrow Mountain Range in the north. Geographically speaking, that's almost all of eastern Alaska, an area more than half the state's residents call home. However, what's shocking is that the rate at which people go missing in this region is almost 2 times higher than the national average. Since 1988, almost 16,000 people have gone missing from the Union's northernmost state, but those are just the official numbers. Others say the number of missing people is closer to 50,000, and that the discrepancy is due to poor management or a deliberate cover-up. However, Alaskan missing persons agencies have been quick to downplay such speculation. According to them, the real number of missing people is just over 1,300, out of a total population of almost 750,000. But at nearly 42 missing persons for every 100,000 citizens, that's still the highest number of missing people per capita in the entire United States. And considering that Arizona comes in second place with only 4.2 missing persons per 100,000, you start to see why things just don't add up. As you can imagine, Alaskan state troopers are almost overwhelmed by the workload and call on more than 1,000 volunteer search and rescue personnel to assist them. But considering they're responsible for more than 500,000 square miles of territory, it's easy to see why such a large force is still considered woefully understaffed. Shaden Lowry, a professional wilderness guide with the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, spoke to the unique nature of search and rescue operations within his home state. People tend to underestimate how wild Alaska is, he said. The scale is difficult to wrap their heads around. Everything is so massive, and the vast majority of the state is still untouched by human infrastructure. Just over 26% of Alaska is still considered wilderness territory, and while that might sound like a relatively small portion, it accounts for more than half of all America's wildlands. This alone could explain the wildly disproportionate number of disappearances, but the terrain is about as unforgiving as it comes. Most of the Alaskan Triangle is dotted with freezing glaciers, deep crevices, and rivers with unimaginably strong currents. There are also rough, winding roads that snake through steep mountain passes, and more than 300,000 grizzly bears, all of which pose an ever-present danger to visitors and year-round residents alike. When people do go missing here in Alaska, it can be very difficult to find them quickly, added wilderness guide Shaden Lowry. A typical search and rescue operation in the lower 48 states has less terrain to search with more manpower to search it. On top of that, the hazards in Alaska make it an extremely hostile environment to be injured or lost in, and the weather can easily put search efforts on hold for days since they rely so heavily on aircraft to access remote areas. The use of the term hostile environment might be an understatement of the century. Out in Alaska, even the smallest of mistakes can prove deadly. In a place where the lowest recorded temperatures have touched -70, something as small as a wet sleeping bag can become the root cause of death by exposure. A lot of the fatalities in our park end up being river-related, as Shaden Lowry continued. People can easily get swept away in even a couple of feet of swiftly moving current or quickly become hypothermic and drown. The same is true for the rest of Alaska's wilderness territory. The state doesn't just have more unexplained disappearances than any other state. It has more incidents of accidental drowning, too, making up 60% of all national park deaths in the entire United States. This has led many, including Shaden Lowry, to conclude that the disappearances in the Alaskan Triangle are down to the state's unparalleled wilderness and hazardous terrain. Yet, there are others who posit less tangible explanations. According to the folklore of Alaska's indigenous tribespeople, the Tlinkits, the disappearances are caused by what they refer to as kushtaka. While some have equated kushtaka to a kind of Alaskan Sasquatch, the Tlinkits are quick to explain that the creature is more like an otter than an ape. Living an amphibious existence near lakes and rivers, the Kushtaka can take on the form of a person's loved ones to lure them to a watery grave. The fact that such a legend has been passed down from generation to generation is a testament to its continued relevance. Yet some point to more contemporary legends to explain the nature of the Alaskan Triangle. Back in November of 1986, a Japan Airlines pilot named Kenju Torochi reported an extended, unexplainable aircraft that appeared to accompany them on a flight into Anchorage International Airport. According to the report, the craft followed us from the Alaskan-Canadian border along a flight plan that flows from Fort Yukon to Fairbanks and then on to Anchorage. A few months later, Captain Torochi reported an identical incident along the same flight path, but the Federal Aviation Administration downplayed the incident. We determined that there was a second radar target at the time of the reported sighting, they said, but it was not another aircraft. It was split radar returned from the Japan Airlines Boeing 747, nothing more than an instrument malfunction. The FAA declared the mystery solved, but Captain Torochi was adamant that it was no mere radar malfunction and that what had followed them was very, very real. However, rather than blame UFOs, there are some who look to more terrestrial phenomenon to explain the Alaskan Triangle. Dark conspiracies talk of a highly secretive pyramid-like structure under the Denali National Park. In theory, the site is home to the physicists and engineers of the top-secret High-Frequency Active Auroral Research, or HAARP program. Officially speaking, the goal of the program is to better understand global weather patterns, but some contend that this is just a cover for the project's true goal, controlling the weather by interrupting the Earth's natural magnetic fields. Some blame the HAARP program for Alaska's notorious winter squalls, snowstorms which are able to bury entire towns in just a few hours. But to date, there's been no proven link between the HAARP program and any of the state's unpredictable weather patterns. This isn't to say that Alaska isn't a place rich in natural beauty, and some of the folks out there in Fairbanks and Anchorage are some of the nicest people it's possible to meet. But the fact remains, Alaska can be an extremely dangerous place for those unfamiliar with the terrain, weather, and wildlife, and unless you've got a great deal of experience in these areas, only the boldest souls can truly conquer the magnificent realms of Alaska. In 2015, 34-year-old Seth Ellingsworth was working a shift at the Hanford nuclear site in his home state of Washington when he suddenly detected an unusual odor. Not long after, he noticed a drastic change in his respiratory health. "I started having breathing problems," said Ellingsworth, "and it hasn't gone away since." Seth went from being a healthy, active father of 4 to a sufferer of reactive airway disease in a matter of months. As the condition became worse, he became unable to work. He now takes a cocktail of drugs and steroids, including sulfuricast, prednisone, and corticosteroids, while being forced to use a bronchodilator on a daily basis. But what did Seth encounter that proved so catastrophic to his health? More than 70 years ago, the Hanford site was charged with producing plutonium for America's arsenal of nuclear weapons. Today, it is managed by the Department of Energy through its contractor, Washington River Protection Solutions, who were awarded a jaw-dropping $110 billion contract to clean up 56 million gallons of chemical and nuclear waste. The effort will require 177 concrete-lined underground tanks, and filling them is expected to take half a decade. However, there's one significant problem. The tanks are leaking, and the noxious toxic waste trickling out into the soil contains chemicals that have been proven to cause brain cancer and lung damage. In 2016 alone, 61 of the site's employees were listed as being exposed to near-fatal doses of chemicals, prompting one nuclear expert to call it an underground Chernobyl just waiting to happen. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S. Department of Energy had conducted almost 20 different studies of the Hanford nuclear site. Every one of them has exposed significant health risks to those employed there. Airborne toxins far exceeded occupational limits, and a definitive link was established between exposure to toxic vapors and tissue damage in a worker's lungs. Washington-based physician Dr. Brian Campbell said he evaluated 29 of Hanford's employees, only to discover, and I quote, "some of the worst cases of dementia that I've ever seen in young people, and more likely than not, it's caused by the exposure they had at Hanford." Dr. Campbell has also claimed that the Department of Energy is trying to sweep the findings under the rug to downplay their own failings and culpability. In spring of 2016, NBC News reached out to dozens of Hanford employees, both past and present. 20 agreed to discuss the devastating effects on their health. One former worker, Diana Gregg, claimed to have developed tremors on the right side of her body, while Lonnie Putty had been diagnosed with severe nerve damage. "Sometimes the pain gets so great I just pass out," he told a news network. Another ex-employee, Mario Diaz, claimed that he was losing his memory and that breathing was becoming increasingly difficult. "The worst part is they didn't share what they knew," Mr. Diaz said. "They knew it was hurting us, but they didn't tell us." Mr. Diaz was told over and over that he was working in a safe, controlled environment, but as he and so many others now know, that simply was not true. He also stated that he was denied access to valuable safety equipment, such as masks and air tanks, and was then threatened with disciplinary action when he insisted on it. In response to the Department of Energy's unwillingness to act on the problem, a local activist group known as the Hanford Challenge began collating evidence of the site's dangers. They've since claimed that 3 local deaths have an undeniable link to incidents of chemical exposure at Hanford. One of these unfortunate souls was a guy named Gary Saul. Gary passed away in 2011 after a long and painful battle with premature dementia. His doctors insisted the diagnosis was work-related, but Gary died before he was able to taste any kind of justice. Following his passing, Gary's family sought the help of the state's lieutenant governor, Cyrus Habib, who later said the circumstances of his death were scandalous. "When you think about the risk not only to the workers, but also to our water supply," Habib related a statement to the press, "it's like a Stephen King novel. This is something that I think everyone in the country should be thinking about." On the other hand, State Attorney Bob Ferguson took a more direct approach and filed a lawsuit against the federal government. "It's unforgivable," he said. "They've known for decades. It's been going on year after year, report after report, and to be candid, they have to live with themselves on that." "I ask the question all the time," Ferguson continued. "How many more workers have to get sick before they do something about it? Please ask them, because I really want to know." The DOE's Deputy Assistant Secretary, Mark Whitney, appeared to respond to the open question by attempting to reassure the public. He stated that all Hanford employees who had been sent for medical evaluation had since returned to work, and that he couldn't comment on those who'd since parted ways with their contractor. However, in a later interview, Assistant Secretary Whitney was confronted with evidence linking Hanford's chemical leaks to the sudden deterioration of their employees' health. He soon changed his tune. "I wish we had a more complete understanding of those circumstances," he said. "Over the last couple of years, a lot of effort has gone into strengthening our efforts to deal with the potential vapor exposure issue, but I'm not a medical professional and can't provide a qualified medical opinion." Whitney then promised that the DOE was in the process of strengthening communication with those affected by the chemical leaks, and that it planned to invest up to $50 million into improved air monitoring. However, months later, the situation still hadn't improved. Towards the summer of 2016, journalists contacted the subcontractor charged with monitoring the air quality around the Hanford toxic waste tanks. Assistant Secretary Whitney had said almost 200,000 air quality readings had never found a single instance of toxic air. But when asked to confirm this, the subcontractor's response spoke volumes. "I'm sorry, but I'm not allowed to discuss that," he told reporters. In 2009, the previously mentioned activist group, the Hanford Challenge, organized a series of privately funded air quality readings around the Hanford waste tanks. Mercury was found at almost 5 times the safe amount, while ammonia was measured at more than 18 times above permitted limits. The group always knew the government was lying to them, but now they had the proof right there in their hands. Assistant Secretary Whitney was quick to make excuses. "I'm not aware of what workers were told, and I don't know anything about those readings," he told reporters. "They could have been taken at the top of a 20 or 40-foot stack where workers wouldn't be." It took until 2014 for the Department of Energy to admit that those who went within 30 feet of the waste tanks were exposed to devastating levels of toxicity. But to some, the danger is far bigger. Seattle-based investigative reporter Susanna Frame says a buildup of vapor in the waste tanks has the potential to spark a catastrophic man-made disaster. "If you care about this country, if you don't want a nuclear disaster, you should care about Hanford," she said, and many would argue that she's right. You see, Hanford is located right on the banks of the Columbia River, which flows down from the Cascade Mountains in the north before snaking east through the city of Portland. If an explosive chain reaction sees the Hanford waste tanks burst, millions of gallons of toxic chemical waste could spill into the river, contaminating the water supply of more than 1 million Americans and turning the entire region into a lifeless, toxic wasteland. Washington River Protection Solutions has since reached an agreement with workers' unions, promising to provide air tanks to all relevant employees. But to many, the policy change comes a day late and $1 short. "Our lives don't matter to them. It's just business," said one former employee. "It costs more money to protect us than it does to fight us." And so with that in mind, you might want to avoid the area around Hanford, especially the town of Richland, which lies just downstream of it. But in the years to come, if Hanford doesn't get on top of their toxic waste leaks, you might want to avoid the entire upper reaches of the west coast of America. There's a district in the city of Los Angeles that's officially known as Central City East. Covering 50 blocks east of downtown, Central City East is home to many of LA's budding artists who make use of the neighborhood's cheap housing while commuting to the neighboring arts district. For this description alone, Central City East might seem none too dissimilar to many other districts and cities around the world. However, for almost 100 years now, it's been a hotbed of homelessness, drug trafficking, and serious violent crime, all while being referred to by another, much more notorious nickname, Skid Row. The term Skid Row is actually derived from an old logging term. Lumberjacks would transport their lumber to a nearby river by sliding them down roads made from grease skids. These lumberjacks would then wait there for transportation back up the hill, and by extension, the term began to be applied to places where people with no employment or prospects gathered in large numbers. Towards the end of the 19th century, the area that would become known as Skid Row was surprisingly prosperous. California was still in the process of being settled, so the demand for temporary laborers was nothing short of astronomical. Legions of seasonal workers would flood the town during harvest time, and the vast majority headed for Central City East, which was home to a number of cheap hotels, theaters, and taverns. But as the demand for work began to dry up, and more of the district's denizens found themselves out of work, severe social problems began to develop. By the 1930s, Skid Row was home to as many as 10,000 unemployed laborers, many of whom turned to drugs, alcohol, and criminality for relief. By the late 1940s, the social contagion seeping out of the area drew the attention of long-serving police chief Clements B. Harrell. Harrell initiated what he referred to as a blockade raid, meaning the entire area was sealed off by police officers, before a dragnet of others swept through the district to pick up pimps, escorts, and dealers. More than 350 people were arrested in what Chief Harrell called a resoundingly successful operation, and to his credit, crime statistics from the period showed a marked drop in violent crime. But the issue was never really cleaning up the neighborhood. It was making sure that it stayed clean. By the mid-50s, the city of Los Angeles had launched several social welfare programs in a bid to rehabilitate Skid Row and its image. A number of so-called sober houses were opened, and the district seemed to take on a redemptive nature rather than a destructive one. But as many suspected, the changes didn't last, and as the psychedelia of the 1960s washed over California, Skid Row once again descended into chaos. By the mid-70s, Skid Row was once again out of control. However, instead, the strong-arm tactics of their forebears, city officials stunned LA citizenry by abandoning the district altogether. In 1976, Skid Row was declared a containment zone, where homelessness and a small-scale narcotics possession would be tolerated. The move coincided with a huge cut in funding for the area, meaning many residents had to rely on charity to get by. It was also around this time that Skid Row's population saw a massive influx of homeless Vietnam veterans, men whose PTSD and drug addiction made them very dangerous individuals. While it was certainly unsafe for outsiders to wander around Skid Row, those who called it home were also victimized with chilling regularity. On 2 consecutive nights during November of 1964, the bodies of 2 homeless men were found with multiple stab wounds. Each had been murdered where they slept, and the level of violence applied during the attacks was shocking to even the most hardened of homicide detectives. But without any idea of who their suspect was, both cases eventually just went cold. And 10 years later, the murders started up again. Only this time, the circumstances were considerably more frightening. From December 1st of 1974 to January 31st of 1975, the bodies of 8 homeless men were found stabbed to death in the alleys and back streets of Skid Row. Each victim had their throat cut from ear to ear, and at each crime scene, the killer had collected a cup of their blood before leaving it next to their lifeless corpses. There was evidence the killer had consumed some of the victims' blood, but with the murders occurring prior to the advent of DNA forensics, such evidence was next to useless. The media dubbed the killer the Skid Row Slasher, and rushed to share police reports that the killer had left a ring of salt around the bodies of some of his victims. This led some to speculate that the murders were related to witchcraft and Satanism, and while the public obsessed over such salacious rumors, the LAPD turned to the FBI's criminal psychologists for assistance. Federal agents estimated that the killer was a white male in his late 20s or early 30s, 6 feet tall and 190 pounds, with shoulder-length stringy blonde hair. He was also described as a venally impotent, poorly educated loner who vented his own feelings of worthlessness on hapless derelicts and down-and-outers. He strongly identifies with the derelicts and drifters he kills, and we think he's trying to resolve his own inner conflicts by turning his wrath and hatred outward. The profile proved to be shockingly accurate. When the LAPD finally found their suspect, he was almost exactly as federal agents had described. Despite being African American, 32-year-old Vaughn Greenwood was indeed a poorly educated loner, but he never revealed the motive behind the murders. Then, on December 30th, 1976, Greenwood was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole on account of, and I quote, his presence in any community would constitute a menace. With the Skid Row Slasher behind bars, a period of relative calm returned to the district. Yet just 3 years later, a familiar pattern began to emerge. On October 23, 1978, a 50-year-old homeless man was found stabbed to death in a Skid Row alleyway. A week later, the killer claimed another 2 victims one night after the other, a pattern which mimicked that of the Skid Row Slasher just a few years before. The following week, the spree intensified with terrifying speed when 3 homeless men were stabbed to death in the space of 7 days, one of the murders occurring right outside LA City Hall, prompting outrage from the public and politicians alike. Many released statements condemning the actions of the man dubbed the Skid Row Stabber, while promising swift justice to those responsible. But that night, the killer claimed another 2 victims in a grim display of homicidal defiance. Several other homeless men were murdered throughout the holiday season, but perhaps the most horrifying was when a second body showed up outside of LA City Hall. The body of 45-year-old Frank Garcia was found on November 23, 1978. Unlike the first murder, which had occurred in the dead of night, Frank had been stabbed to death in the early evening while a large crowd had been present outside of City Hall. Somehow, the killer had managed to kill a man with hundreds of witnesses present, yet not a single witness came forward with any pertinent information. Even more perplexing is the fact that a handprint was found in the soil next to Frank's body, but after careful analysis, police determined that the handprint belonged to neither Frank nor his killer. Someone had seen Frank's body that night, and they'd been so close that they'd almost touched it, but still, they didn't come forward. It set a grim tone for the investigation that followed. This wasn't just a serial killer. Someone was making a statement, and the public was either too afraid or too callous to help stop it. Thankfully, the police were able to track down an associate of a victim named David Jones. The pair couldn't be described as friends, but shortly before he disappeared, the associate noticed Jones in the company of a man named Luther. 3 months later, in January 1979, a piece of graffiti in the Los Angeles bus terminal prompted a 911 call. It said, "My name is Luther, and I will kill winos." The graffiti prompted the police to search for the mysterious Luther, who said to be an Afro-Latino man in his early 30s. However, their search was interrupted by a call from the LAPD's fingerprint recognition expert. A print taken from the scene of Frank Garcia's body was found to belong to 29-year-old Bobby Joe Maxwell, who had been released from prison in his native Tennessee only to relocate to Los Angeles a year before the murders. Maxwell spent a lot of his spare time hanging out in Skid Row and was said to frequently harass the local homeless population. Not only that, but as late as December 1978, he was arrested after violently accosting a trio of sleeping homeless men and was in possession of a knife at the time of his arrest. He spent the next several weeks in the LA County Jail, and during this period, the stabber did not commit any murders. However, the final murder occurred just 3 days after Maxwell was released. Based on the timing, as well as the direct evidence of the handprint, Bobby Joe Maxwell was arrested in April 1979. During a search of his apartment, a large amount of seized literature proved that Maxwell was a practicing Satanist. However, Maxwell's preferred school of Satanism was not the harmlessly rebellious kind made famous by the likes of Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley, but rather a dark and disturbingly violent philosophy that required direct human sacrifice. For legal and bureaucratic reasons, Maxwell's trial didn't begin for another 5 years, but when it did, the statements of the prosecution's key witness proved devastating. Sidney Storch, a 37-year-old convicted felon, was Maxwell's cellmate for 3 weeks during 1983. Storch claimed that during this time, Maxwell had extensively recounted his murders of homeless men and was not only proud of it, but was quite convinced that he'd be found innocent on account of a deal he'd made with a very powerful person. In addition to such damning testimony, Maxwell's handwriting was also a dead match for the Luther graffiti left in the LA bus terminal. Prosecutors also established that the knife found on Maxwell's person during his December 1978 arrest was the exact size and shape as the one used by the Skid Row stabber. At the conclusion of his trial, Bobby Joe Maxwell was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and at his sentencing in late 1984, he was handed life without parole. The media and the wider public celebrated the conviction as if he had been convicted of all 11 murders, but serious questions remained unanswered. For example, how could law enforcement, as well as the jury by extension, be so confident of Maxwell's guilt when there wasn't a shred of physical evidence connecting him to the crime? To those in dissent, Maxwell had been convicted because of who he was, not what he had done, and that constituted a complete miscarriage of justice. But surprisingly, neither the media nor the wider public cared for the nuance of the situation. They wanted the killer caught, and the only thing that would rob them of their satisfaction would be if the Skid Row stabbings continued. However, they didn't, and if the stabber really wasn't Maxwell, then the trial and media frenzy that followed his arrest were enough to frighten them into inactivity. As mob fervor died down, the debate surrounding Maxwell's potential innocence intensified. Over the next 30 years, he lodged a series of increasingly convincing appeals, culminating in the 2010 discovery that the prosecution's star witness had given false testimonies in court, possibly as a result of LAPD intimidation. An investigation showed the same witness had lied in 6 other cases, and as he was a former police officer, the political and legal turmoil that resulted sent shockwaves through the California law enforcement community. Bobby Joe Maxwell's conviction was soon overturned, and the appellate court announced a retrial was in the works. But frustratingly, at the end of 2017, Bobby Joe suffered a severe heart attack and fell into a coma. He never regained consciousness but was declared not guilty in August of 2018 and went on to pass away in April of the following year, having never gotten to enjoy his vindication. To this day, the identity of the Skid Row stabber remains a mystery, and they're unlikely to be caught anytime soon. The level of crime that occurs in Skid Row, as well as the wider Los Angeles area, means little attention can be devoted to old cases. After all, fresh ones are coming in every single day. And just after midnight on November 28, 2010, 49-year-old Herbert White received a call on his cell phone. White was a former cocaine addict who had managed to turn his life around, and he spent a great deal of his spare time helping out his various Narcotics Anonymous sponsors. Herb's wife was used to such late-night phone calls, as her husband often rolled out of bed in the wee small hours of the morning to help out a sponsor in need. That night, the call had come from Edward and Melissa Garcia, a drug-addicted married couple Herb had met in a bank a few days prior. Having recognized them to be down on their luck, Herb had given them his cell phone and promised to help them if they ever wanted to get sober. The call had come sooner than expected, but he was ready when it came. Herb met the couple in a dark parking lot. They were penniless, homeless, and claimed to be going through severe withdrawals. Herb drove them to a small hotel on Skid Row where they checked into room 66. Any other couple might have shown gratitude for such a display of generosity, but instead, what Edward and Melissa did was the very definition of evil. The following morning, a member of the hotel's housekeeping team stopped by the room to perform her daily duties. She found the room unlocked, with the bed stripped of sheets, and sitting on the bare mattress, perfectly positioned in the center, was Herbert White's LA Lakers baseball cap. At the foot of the bed was a large black backpack, and the air in the room was thick with a stench of death. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the housekeeper rushed to fetch the hotel's manager, who foolishly walked into the room and opened up the backpack. Inside were 2 severed human arms, bound with duct tape, and underneath the bed was the dismembered torso of Herbert White. Edward and Melissa Garcia were swiftly tracked down and arrested, and at their trial for Herbert's murder, their harrowing motives were revealed to the court. Based on statements collected by the LAPD, the state's prosecutor told jurors that the couple had a long-held fantasy of killing someone and then dismembering their body, and what the state called, and I quote, a ritual murder. Defense attorneys offered a different version of events, one in which White had been selling the couple crystal methamphetamine, and his death was the result of a drug deal gone wrong. The court heard that Edward and Melissa had only recently moved to Los Angeles from their native Pennsylvania and had lived out of their car until it was towed. They briefly took refuge in a Hollywood Hills homeless encampment until it was bulldozed and then relocated to Skid Row. The Garcia's attorney painted a picture of a desperate couple who'd simply defended themselves after their exploitation turned violent, but the prosecution made it clear that they were no angels. 18 months before the murder of Herbert White, the Garcias hatched a plan that involved Melissa posing as an escort, luring a man to their apartment. When their mark arrived and disrobed, Edward sprang out of the darkness with a knife and took the man prisoner. The couple then attempted to lure a second victim to the apartment, but both victims escaped when their scheme suddenly unraveled. Having learned from the mistakes of their first attempt, the Garcias tried their plan a second time after arriving in Los Angeles. The court heard that after a brief struggle, Herbert was knocked unconscious and then bound with duct tape. However, instead of simply killing him as quickly and quietly as possible, the Garcias tortured Herbert extensively before delivering the fatal stab wound. Following Herbert's death, the Garcias began to quite literally butcher him. An LA County coroner stated that the way in which Herbert's body had been dismantled was somewhat impressive, not unlike a surgeon. However, the coroner also mentioned that sections of the victim's legs had been filleted, suggesting that the Garcias planned to consume some of Herbert's flesh once they had the opportunity. I could feel what my son felt that night, Herbert's mother stated at the trial's conclusion, and I miss him every day. She spoke of his love for basketball and how he seemed to put the needs of just about everyone else in his life before his own. But what would drive two people, no matter how disturbed they are, to take the life of someone so selfless in such a horrifying manner? Clearly, Skid Row isn't just a place of murder and malevolence, it's a place of mystery too. Many of those mysteries involve a place once known as the Cecil Hotel. Now, I won't go into too much detail on this last point because I've covered the Cecil in a previous video, but for those unfamiliar with the Cecil Hotel and the unsettling things that have occurred in its recent past, here's a brief primer. Beginning in 1931, the hotel hosted a number of bizarre incidents involving individuals taking their own lives or being victims of murders, and it was once said to be the temporary residence of the Night Stalker serial killer Richard Ramirez. However, in more recent years, the Cecil has retained its infamy due to the mysterious death of Canadian student Elisa Lam. Elisa's body was recovered from a large water tank atop the Cecil's roof, where she had been a guest at the time of her death. She was last seen alive on January 31st of 2013, and her body was discovered by a hotel maintenance worker investigating complaints of low water pressure. Interest in Elisa's disappearance peaked around 2 weeks later when the LAPD released security footage of her behaving strangely in a hotel elevator on the day she died. After an autopsy declared the cause of her death inconclusive, the video of her fearful mannerisms went viral, and there was an intense online speculation as to what exactly happened to her. In the weeks that followed, the LA County Coroner's Office ruled the death an accident, with Elisa's bipolar disorder being a significant contributing factor. However, to this day, her ultimate fate remains a hotly debated mystery. At the end of the day, Skid Row is just as dangerous as those unfortunate enough to be homeless there as it is for residents and visitors. But what's undeniable is that the district attracts a certain kind of malevolent individual who wants nothing more than to prey on the most vulnerable. However, with LA's seeming inability to deal with the issue, the situation just gets worse and worse. And now, just like in the past, things are getting out of control. And it's only a matter of time before another knife-wielding maniac heads down to Skid Row to hunt where their prey is bountiful, and the eyes are turned blind. During the late spring of 1960, a Utah-based rancher noticed something curious while taking a walk on his land after sundown. Out of a section of rocky ground, a slender plume of steam appeared to be rising into the cold night air. The rancher made a note of its location, then retired to his home for the night. The next morning, he contacted Salt Lake City-based caving enthusiast Dale Green and invited him to survey the land. Dale accepted the invitation, and sometime later, he arrived at the ranch in the company of several fellow cavers. Within a matter of hours, the team traced the steam vents to a narrow surface hole about a half a mile away, and after establishing that the cave system was stable enough to explore, they descended into the darkness. Over the course of the next few hours, the team mapped out over 400 meters of chutes and tunnels, and although the passageways appeared to be stable, they were lined with a damp clay that rubbed off on the caver's skin and clothing. Everybody who goes through that cave comes out covered with clay, Dale Green later said, and when we went in, there was no sign anyone had been there before us. Since the cave system appeared to be unexplored, it fell to Dale to give it a name. One came to mind almost immediately. Before their exploration, the clay-lined tunnels had been smooth and unblemished, But as the team made their way out, they saw that the walls were dotted with impressions of their fingers and palms. To Dale, it was reminiscent of silly putty, but in light of the reddish-brown clay that now covered his clothes, he decided on a similar one, Nutty Putty. The Nutty Putty cave system soon fell under the remit of the Utah state government, who turned over the management of them to a local caving club known as Timpanogos Grotto. For the next 4 decades, the cave system was frequented by several amateur caving groups, including a number of local Boy Scout troops who were excited to explore the subterranean twists and turns. Yet it was during one of these visits that a scout became trapped inside a particularly narrow passageway. The small tunnel diverted from the scout's prearranged route, but as boisterous young boys are prone to do, he wandered off course and subsequently became trapped. Despite a minor panic ensuing, the boy was soon found and freed by search and rescue personnel. But just months later, the same thing happened all over again. Over the years that followed, several other instances of trapped cavers prompted the Timpanogos Grotto to put several safeguards in place. By the early 2000s, the cave system was receiving over 5,000 visitors a year and had been for quite some time. Such public demand was great news for the caving club, but not so great for the cave itself. The excessive visitation had resulted in a gradual smoothening of the tunnel walls, meaning certain sections had become extremely slippery underfoot. One passage, known as the Big Slide, was set at almost exactly 45 degrees, rendering it potentially fatal to inexperienced cavers. In 2006, efforts to curb the number of annual visitors to Nutty Putty were made in the hopes of slowing down the gradual erosion of the clay walls. This coincided with certain sections of the cave being completely closed off to the public, with the Big Slide becoming the focus of the caving club's fears. As a result, an impassable steel gate was installed at the slide's entrance during May of 2006, completely barring it from public entry. However, some of the cave's more challenging sections were what drew such vast public interest in the first place, and with access denied, admission numbers dropped steadily for the next 3 years. Eventually, in 2009, the Timpanogos Grotto Caving Club made the difficult decision to reopen the previously closed-off tunnels, but only to members of the public who completed a fairly strict application process. Applicants had to demonstrate familiarity with caving and tunneling, and agree to don all the necessary safety gear before heading underground. A few months later, the grotto received an application from the local Jones family, who wished to explore the caves as a kind of Thanksgiving bonding experience. Their now grown-up children had explored caves with their father during their youth, adding an element of nostalgia to the visit. But for one of them, it was a trip that they'd never return from. 26-year-old John Edward Jones had returned to his native Utah from Virginia, where he studied medicine while living with his wife and 1-year-old daughter. Then, on November 24th of 2009, he and 9 of his friends and family drove out to Nutty Putty for an evening of adventure caving. John first climbed down in the caves at around 8 p.m. that night, having expressed his desire to explore one of the narrower caves that had been christened the Birthing Canal. But on his way there, he took a wrong turn and ended up in an uncharted tunnel near a section known as Ed's Push. John was suddenly faced with a pitch-black hole almost directly beneath his feet, one that sank down into the very bowels of the earth, and in entering it head first, he made the last mistake of his young life. Believing he was in the marginally wider Birthing Canal, John crawled into the hole expecting the narrow passage to open up into a much larger cave. It was considered a rite of passage for many cavers, and considering he was a local boy, it may surprise you to learn that John had never visited the Nutty Putty caves before. His father may well have considered them to be too advanced for him back when he was a kid, especially in light of the reoccurring incidents involving Boy Scouts. As a result, John may have considered traversing the tunnels a point of pride, an old score to be settled, and as such, he put his all into pushing himself deeper and deeper into the uncharted tunnel until he found that he was stuck. In any other situation, this might not have been a problem, as a caver can simply back up and reverse until it's possible to turn around. But John was stuck at a downward 70-degree angle, with gravity rendering retreat impossible. Within just a few minutes, the Jones family realized just how much danger John was in, and they rushed to summon highly trained search and rescue personnel who specialized in freeing trapped cavers. Over the next 27 hours, more than 100 different rescue workers, both professional and amateur, descended on the Nutty Putty cave system to offer any help they could. After failing to dislodge John with their bare hands, rescue workers tried a number of other methods, including an intricate system of ropes and pulleys in order to free the trapped caver. But sadly, none of their techniques proved successful, and one rescuer was severely injured when one attempt went badly wrong. Perhaps the most pressing issue was John's positioning. If he'd been trapped upright, the rescue effort could have extended for days, possibly even weeks, but the human body is simply not designed to be upside down for long periods of time, and around the 20-hour mark, John complained of feeling increasingly lightheaded and short of breath. Around a year before John became trapped, Dr. J. Kahn of the Minneapolis Medical School explained the dangers of remaining upside down for too long in the run-up to a stunt performed by street magician David Blaine. A person's lower extremities have constrictor mechanisms that protect blood vessels from damage when we stand up, he explained. But the brain does not have such constrictor mechanisms. Therefore, remaining in upside-down position for prolonged periods of time may lead to blood vessels rupturing or blood leakage. This is because blood would pool in the skull, causing pressure to build up inside the brain and eyes, causing bleeding, strokes, seizures, or even death. The rescue workers knew how much danger John was in, and once he complained of feeling poorly, they expedited their efforts in the hopes of saving his life. But sadly, and despite the valiant efforts of all involved, John Edward Jones passed away just before midnight on November 25th, just one day before Thanksgiving. Since it proved impossible to retrieve his body, the state of Utah declared the Nutty Putty cave system to be John Edward Jones' final resting place, and would, therefore, be closed to public entry. Many believe this was the most respectful course of action and agreed with the state's decision to forbid any further attempts to retrieve John's body, yet others disagreed. Cave specialist John Jasper, who has led many young groups to visit Nutty Putty, believes exploring caves is safe and fun, provided you take proper safety measures. He also believes that the decision to close the caves is a hysterical overreaction, and that every possible effort should be made to retrieve John's body for a proper burial and reopen the caves to the public. Others have not been so reasonable. On April 4th, 2018, the plaque that was engraved to memorialize John was reported to have been vandalized, and may suspect that disgruntled cavers are to blame. But if those kinds of people want to face running into John's still-trapped skeleton, they should be welcome to. After all, if they're not careful, they might just end up joining him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, origami toes.